This is the Shoot Once podcast. I'm Frank Walker. Welcome to the Shoot Once podcast. Proud member of the Hockey Podcast Network, and another week where we surprisingly found a lot of things to talk about, even though not a single hockey game's been played. So, jumping right into it, it's been a big week for Blue Jackets news. Kind of the first big story out of the that came across, Mikhail Grigorenko, a free agent from Russia, kind of signed with the Blue Jackets. Apparently what happened, so the Blue Jackets made a deal with him. He agreed to a one-year contract. The problem then became that apparently it was outside of the right signing window because he is technically a UFA. He is not signing an entry-level contract like a lot of these other guys who are signing on to come to the NHL for the first time. So the Blue Jackets technically signed an illegal contract with him. There's no problems out of it. It's just that he said, and the club has said, once the right time hits, they'll sign it. When that's going to be, who knows right now because of what's going on with everything. I really liked what Corey Pronger wrote about him in The Athletic. This sense of, essentially, he's a player who started off, he had a lot of potential. Then he was drafted, kind of fell out of the NHL. Apparently he's grown a lot in his time in the KHL. So there's a real positive thought about what he's going to be. Yarmo's talked about him saying he's a forward that can play all three lines, that he's got some skill. Or not all three lines, all three forward positions. Has a lot of skill. Exactly the kind of player the Blue Jackets need. Then as far also as other team news coming out of the week, Elvis Merzlikins signs his 2-year deal worth $8 million, essentially a $4 million a year AAV. The big news for the Blue Jackets is over the next 2 years, we have the goalies signed and have it under $7 million for both goalies, which is a great deal. If you can get two goaltenders that you think are kind of that NHL quality goaltender for under $8 million for both of them, that's real good. We'll take that. We'll take that any day of the week. So it's happy to see that deal get done. Looking forward to seeing Elvis's next 2 years in Columbus. I'm happy to see him sticking around. We'll talk more about Elvis later in this episode. Also, as far as stuff coming back, over the last couple weeks, there's been a lot of forward momentum into that happening. We talked about Dr. Fauci talking about what it would take. If you've been looking at our YouTube channel, there's the video I put up about them talking about different spots for it and why I think the Midwest is a great spot if you were going to do 3-4 different arenas. At this point, we're seeing different reports coming out. Anything from May 15th being the day teams start coming back. We're starting to hear a lot June 1st as well, as far as when teams will start coming back to start kind of working out and to try and start getting back into game shape. I think either one of those is possible. We're starting to see a lot of states talking about easing restrictions come May 1st. Now, some states have already gone ahead and done it. We'll see how that affects things. Again, everything's fluid. If in a week from now, all of a sudden you're seeing spikes all over the place in infection rates and hospitalization rates, everything might go downhill. Now, I'm seeing a lot of people talk about, what's changed? Nothing's changed. We don't have a vaccine yet. How can we do anything? I live in a state where our state government in Ohio was very clear about what they were trying to do. At least I feel like they were clear in that what you're trying to avoid with what you're doing when you shut everything down is you're buying a lot of time. And when they talk about flattening the curve, there's two things you can do to flatten that curve. One is to slow the rate of infection, which we've done by all this social distancing and shutting things down. The other thing you can do, the other part of flattening the curve, because remember, you're trying to keep it under the line of what the hospitalization rate is. If you can make hospital capacity higher, then that curve can get a little higher and you can be fine. And in Ohio, what's happened over the last month of all this, essentially Ohio's done some interesting stuff where they've divided the state into zones. Each zone has certain hospitals that are designated as kind of where COVID patients are going to go. And then they've built out into convention centers and tons of places, tons of additional hospital rooms. So the idea being that if we do get a spike later, we will be better prepared for it than we were a month ago. And at this point, there's been another month of fighting the disease, so there's more ideas on treatments and different things like that. So, I mean, there are ways to get some things back to normal without vaccines. Now, again, putting people back in the stands, that can get tricky, but making the games essentially productions for television, that feels like something that can be on the table. Again, I'm not an epidemiologist, but some of the epidemiologists are saying things like this. So that's where I think I've got some level of confidence to say this might work. So honestly, look for it here in the next week or two. I'm not week or two, but in the next few weeks, looks like there'll be more news coming out about that. So I'm excited for where things are going. And as far as this Grigorenko signing and the Merzlikins signing, we're going to do some in-depth stuff on that. Between the podcast here and now, we're doing more stuff on the YouTube stream. Which, hey, go check that out. Just go to YouTube. The channel is Shoot Once Podcast. You'll be able to find it. We're putting video versions of the shows on there now, as well as I'm trying to do at least once a week, just kind of a general video about something else. And they're shorter. They're not like the shows are, but they tend to be maybe a 5 or 10 minute thing that's got a little more visual involved as far as the discussion about hockey or the logistics around what's going on, something like that. Maybe sometimes it's just having fun, but please check it out. What we've got today on the show, which I'm really excited about, a guy that if you've seen him on Twitter, you've seen me maybe retweet some of his stuff, or you saw him get into some arguments with some people a week ago when he did his 31 teams in 31 days, and when he got to the Blue Jackets, he had an interesting take on Seth Jones, which we get into, but Mr. J Fresh Hockey, listed on the 50 must-follows on The Athletic as far as hockey fans go, had a great conversation with him about the Blue Jackets. So relax, enjoy the show, and thanks for listening. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. J Fresh Hockey.
All right, and now speaking to a man who has been listed as one of the top 50 Twitter follows for hockey from The Athletic. Welcome to the Shoot Once Podcast, Jay Fresh. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. How about you?
Oh, doing real well. Thank you for asking. So first thing I do want to ask you, I mean, who are you? How'd you get into this? What about you said, hey, I want to start making these cool visualizations for stats on hockey? What started all that for you?
Yeah, I'm a graduate student in international politics in Toronto. Really not too much of a stats background or kind of a sports media background or anything like that. Really, it just came down to I am a huge hockey fan and increasingly into hockey analytics, and just kind of had all these data sources newly available to me. I'd subscribed to them on Patreon or what have you, and really just wanted kind of a way to bring them all together. So really, I was just making these visualizations just for myself, or even just for a couple of friends, kind of on an off chance. Decided to start a Twitter account, post them online. Figured I'd get maybe a couple dozen followers, and here we are 2 months later, and it seems like people have kind of taken notice a little bit, which is pretty fun. But so not really much of a stats background for me, not like some of the guys that you see out there like Evolving Wild or Michael McCurdy, who really come from that kind of hard stats modeling background. Really kind of my entire role in this is just trying to find pretty ways to visualize it and maybe tell a story with it that can make it a little clearer for people like me who don't really know the nuts and bolts of stats innately or aren't quite savvy in that regard.
That's really cool. Just hearing so many stories like that, where it's people who weren't necessarily numbers people, but just finding all this new information. Awesome. I do have to ask you as we're starting, because your avatar on Twitter is Jack Johnson. Why Jack Johnson?
I guess there's a connection there. You guys are well acquainted with my news. I mean, when I started the account, like I said, I wasn't expecting any traction on that whatsoever. So I just kind of needed an avatar, needed something to fill it in. I knew that I wasn't going to be kind of connecting it to, my real life persona or anything like that. It was just going to be kind of a fun project. So really, I just kind of picked, I think Jack Johnson's my avatar on a couple other hockey communities and forums and stuff like that. So kind of just went with that as a placeholder, and I've kind of stuck with it now. So I've kind of said to a couple people, I'm in the process of figuring out what I'm going to change it to, probably to a logo for my website coming up or something like that. But for now, I could have picked less handsome guys than Jack Johnson. So
that is
everybody's
true.
pretty happy with that. He's not much of a defenseman, but he's a bit of a looker.
Not much of a defenseman, but a looker. That's good. Yeah, Jack Johnson's got a now very complicated relationship with Blue Jackets fans. So
I guess so. Yeah, it turned out that you scratched him because of his play and not because of anything else.
yeah.
Which was not what I was assured when when the Penguins signed him for 5 years.
Yeah, we were told there was all these nefarious, diabolical reasons for doing so. So getting from a defenseman that you love to one that apparently you obviously hate. If people have been following along and out on your Twitter account, you've been going kind of doing some visualizations for each team over the month of April here. And on day 9, you did the Blue Jackets. And what's been kind of what would be deemed a hot take if it was just, you sitting and yelling into a TV camera, was that that Seth Jones he's got a reputation as an elite defenseman, but you don't think his numbers show that. So what's behind your thought on that with Seth Jones?
Yeah, so Jones is a guy who I think a lot of people, not even just Blue Jackets fans, but I think a lot of people around the NHL kind of are increasingly describing as kind of a top 5 defenseman in the NHL, or like one of the best players in the league. And I've been kind of going over each team, looking at all these players and everything, and he really just doesn't live up to that reputation for me. I obviously, I don't watch him on a day-to-day basis, but I feel like if you took his statistical profile, in a kind of every aspect and put a different name on it, I feel like people wouldn't be profiling him as an elite player. So, for instance, I'm kind of looking especially at his offensive play. His offensive numbers have really trailed off, especially kind of since, the 16, 17, 17, 18 season, which is when legitimately I feel like he could be described as an elite defenseman. And I think that for a lot of people around the NHL, as fans wise, like maybe not Blue Jackets fans, that's kind of what they're thinking of when they talk about Seth Jones, is that kind of 2017, 2018 stretch, kind of right after he came to the Jackets in that Ryan Johansson trade, which, don't get me wrong, is a clear win for the Jackets in my mind. I think that's kind of what they have in their mind, but I think his offensive play in particular has really trailed off, and I don't think his even strength defensive numbers really support the idea that I don't think they're quite enough to bring him to the echelon that people consider him to be. So I think I don't think he's a bad defenseman. I certainly don't think he's Jack Johnson. I would trade 50 Jack Johnsons for him. But I just think he maybe gets his reputation drummed up a little bit by the name recognition, by the memory of those kind of better seasons, and then also by the fact that he plays a crap load of minutes, which I think in a lot of people's mind is something that kind of directly correlates to somebody being a good defenseman or an elite defenseman, is whether they play a lot of minutes. So it's really nothing personal for me with Seth Jones, but I do think that there's a couple of places where people kind of make excuses for his poor numbers that I don't think are quite fair, and we could dive into more of that if you want.
Well, one question I did have, because I'm looking at the visualization you put up on Twitter there for it, as far as his weighted numbers. And you're right. I mean, there is, in these numbers, there's specifically kind of a drop over the last 3 years on some things. The numbers that you're looking at, are any of them corrected for things such as like zone starts and all that, or?
Yeah. So just to give some background on where the numbers are coming from. So goals above replacement. Well, so in this case, it's using expected goals above replacement and expected wins above replacement, which is a model created by Evolving Wild, who are kind of two, they're twins. They're statistical analysts who come from Minnesota, and one of the main points of that model is to create a number that adjusts for kind of all of those contextual issues that a lot of people tend to have with advanced stats. So it does adjust for zone starts, it adjusts for teammates, it adjusts for playing at home, playing on the road, competition. So that's kind of a big thing that people will usually glom onto, is kind of saying like, oh, well, this defenseman's numbers are actually not so great because he plays against the team's best players. But kind of the whole point of the model is that it addresses if your player plays against the team's top players. So it is adjusted for those things. And obviously, no statistical model is going to capture absolutely everything. But I think that the results are decisive enough that they lead me to a pretty strong conclusion that at least his offensive game has taken quite a bit of a hit in the past couple of years. And I think that's supported by other models that people have made.
So, I mean, you've said that, some people talk about him as a top 5 player in the league, and you're not sure about that. From when you've been looking at the whole league, do you still see him as a top pair defenseman? I mean, is that still, he's still in that category in your mind of it, correct? Or no?
I would say, I think that he's certainly not going to hurt a top pair. Again, this feels very weird to say about a guy with the kind of the pedigree of Seth Jones. It kind of makes me feel like I'm like kind of playing God here, assigning him a role that he would be good for. I think right now, based on how he profiles over the past 3 years, I see him as clearly a top 4 defenseman, clearly a solid defensive player, an above average player at even strength at defense. But I think just, again, because he plays those kind of escalated minutes, I think it's kind of tough to place an exact role that I would give him. I think, again, one thing that people kind of often misunderstand about analytics is that they're not necessarily a measure of a player's ability, but they're just a player's performance. And that's something that's kind of come up in a couple arguments lately, is that, to say that Seth Jones's play lives up to or profiles more as kind of top 4 caliber play doesn't mean necessarily that Seth Jones, his innate ability or talent is that of only a top 4 defenseman, or that he, I mean, he's only 25 years old. He's going to be 26 years old next year. I mean, this is a guy who has, it's very possible that he hasn't seen his best years yet. But again, I think that, we as people who are trying to analyze hockey through a statistical lens, we can only really account for what's in front of us, and the stats that we have and the models that are available. And from that perspective, I think that it would be difficult and straining credulity to kind of look at the profile that Seth Jones has put out on there on the ice from a statistical perspective and conclude that he is kind of the top pairing or even number 1 defenseman that he's said to be.
Okay. No, I can respect that view of it, because you're right. You're evaluating what you've seen as far as what the numbers are telling us over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I guess just kind of a couple more things, because I've been, part of kind of going through team by team here is that I've kind of interacted with a lot of people from different fan bases, including the Blue Jackets fans, and I think I kind of posted this thread onto the Columbus Blue Jackets subreddit just kind of out of curiosity to see how it would be received, and as I expected, I got quite a bit of hostility for the Jones take, which I think led me, and even actually from some kind of more mainstream parts of Blue Jackets Twitter, like I think that their athletic reporter kind of quote tweeted this and said, here are the limits of analytics, because his, from the eye test, he looks like a top defenseman, and there were some kind of comments about microstats and stuff like that. So I kind of dug a little bit more into it, because I do agree that, when I'm kind of putting these visualizations out there that are kind of based on wins above replacement or goals above replacement, that's kind of an impressionistic, I'm kind of trying to put things out there so you can kind of quickly have some kind of snapshot of the general quality of a player's impact. But I do think that there's something worthwhile when there's a player whose reputation is so at odds with what the analytical profile is, to kind of dig a little bit deeper and try to dissect things a little bit more. So I kind of went into a couple of the counterpoints that people brought up about Jones. The first one is kind of the whole microstats thing. So for people who might not be aware, microstats are kind of an increasingly popular thing in the analytics community, where people will kind of manually track events and data that aren't tracked by the NHL. And so that would be things like, zone exits, zone entries, transition play, passing to a shot, stuff like that, stuff that kind of creates a bit of a clearer picture of what's going on the ice. And it was pointed out to me that Seth Jones does fare quite well by these microstats. And I think that was kind of a big rebuttal that I was getting, was that, Jones is, his numbers, his shot impact, stuff like that might not be so great, but he's still an elite transition player. And so I kind of dug into that a little bit. And what I found was that while Jones does grade out pretty well in a lot of those metrics, especially in transition play and stuff like that, I found that the entire Blue Jackets top 4 also does pretty well in that regard. If you look at the kind of visualizations that people have made, of just kind of, carrying in with the puck, carries per 60, stuff like that, you're going to see Ryan Murray and Zach Werenski right there with him. And in some cases, Dean Kukan. Kukan? I don't think
Dean
I've ever
Kukan.
Kukan.
Yeah, people say it both ways. So
who I mean, clearly is pretty underrated if I don't even know how to pronounce his name. But so that was a big one for me, was just kind of, a bit of a corrective on the idea that you can just say, well, he's an elite transition player and kind of brush that away, because I think clearly there's something in the way that John Tortorella is managing his defense and the way that he prefers for them to play on the puck that's kind of elevating Jones's numbers in that category, and maybe kind of making him look good. There was another one, which is kind of the Zach Werenski thing. Like a lot of people have said, Jones kind of muddles along so that Werenski can fly, which also wasn't quite borne out by the numbers, where kind of Jones had pretty similar numbers with or without Werenski from an aggregate standpoint. So kind of when Jones is playing with Werenski, he's, the team is obviously has like a little bit more offense, but it also has a little worse defense. When he's playing without Werenski, his offense takes a big hit, but his defense is a little bit better. So really no kind of big swing there that would taint the results of these models significantly. And then kind of the last one, and I think the most interesting one, the one that I think is worth getting into and will probably lead to, if you want to talk about goalies later on, is what the hell happened to the Jackets after Jones got hurt. Because, clearly something happened to the Jackets, because we were talking about Tortorella is running away with the Coach of the Year award, and then suddenly the team completely fell apart halfway through February.
Yeah.
But so I dug into that too, because that seemed like a pretty good rebuttal. Is, if Jones is so expendable or so mediocre or average or whatever, then why the hell did the Blue Jackets completely collapse after that? So I dug into a couple of the numbers with that, as far as their team defense numbers, as well as their goaltending, and what I found was a pretty clear and pretty dramatic drop off in the Blue Jackets goaltending performance after he got hurt, but in a way that is not accounted for by, or sorry, that does not follow that it was a huge drop in team defense quality. So, like, for example, like before Jones got hurt, the Jackets were the third best defensive team in the NHL in terms of expected goals against, which is, I think, right now the best measure that we have of team defense, because it measures the quantity and quality of chances that a team is giving up. So for the lion's share of the season, the Jackets were the third best defensive team in the league. In just the time that Jones was hurt, they were the eighth best defensive team in the league. So it was a little bit of a drop off, as you might expect from losing a player who's a strong defensive player like Seth Jones is, but only to the tune of kind of 0.1 expected goals against per game, which is not too significant. At the same time, before Jones got hurt, the Jackets had the best 5-on-5 goaltending in the NHL, which is not what I would have expected to say about Jackets goaltending if you asked me in October. But nonetheless, so they were getting ridiculous goaltending for the first part of the season. After he got hurt, they got the 28th best goaltending in the NHL. So if you dig into, obviously save percentage is pretty flawed because it doesn't account for quality. So if you, again, dive into that, going specifically for Elvis, his expected save percentage based on the quality and quantity of shots he was facing was the same before and after Jones's injury. The only difference is that before Jones's injury, he had a .931 5-on-5 save percentage. After Jones's injury, he had a .902 save percentage. So the question that I would have, and because I think it's a fair point for people to say, well, come on, is it that much of a, how much of a coincidence can it be that the goalie completely fell off a cliff right after Jones got hurt? But I mean, again, I can only really account for the numbers that I have in front of me. And those numbers suggest that the team defense really did not take much of a hit as far as the kind of quality of shots that they allowed after Jones got hurt. And it was the goaltending that really fell off a cliff. So, I mean, my conclusion from that would just be that Elvis Merzlikins is not the best goalie in the NHL. As I know that's very tough to hear, but that Merzlikins maybe just kind of fell to earth at a pretty predictable time that he would fall to earth, and it just so happened to align with Seth Jones's injury. So, that's kind of my comprehensive deep dive on kind of why I think that some of those indicators that might lead people to, overstate, in my opinion, the impact that Seth Jones had on the Blue Jackets' success this year, and the impact that the lack of Seth Jones had on the Blue Jackets' lack of success later on, it might be a little overstated. But I'd be interested to hear kind of what you'd have to disagree with me on that.
Well, so my thought is probably similar to, and I think it was probably Allison Lukin that was the person that was responding to you at the transition metrics.
For sure.
And there is and again, I'm not nearly as deep into the numbers as a lot of these things are. So it's going to be from watching games what I've seen a lot of situations of Seth Jones seems to create a lot around him. Not necessarily direct assists, but it's a lot of that transition stuff. And it's funny that you mentioned the whole, that it might be how John Tortorella coaches them. Because there was a story that I think Allison Lukin was the one who wrote it in The Athletic about how the Jackets have an internal metric that was developed by one of the coaches that essentially scores players transitioning the puck, getting it into zones, out of zones, all of that kind of stuff.
That's interesting.
And and that when they score that metric, they said, Seth Jones normally is scoring at the top of it, that it's that kind of thing. So there's those things that a lot of Blue Jackets fans see. It is interesting on our team to have one defenseman who has a high reputation like Seth Jones, who doesn't score as much as another defenseman who has a high reputation but not as high as Jones, in Zach Werenski, who scores a lot of goals, especially for a defenseman. I think he led the league in goals by a defenseman when everything came to a pause. So on my side, it is, when you see Seth Jones play, there's a lot of, and maybe that some of this is confirmation bias that I have in my head. Oh, he's a great defenseman. So when I see him do something great, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that's exactly what we want. But I can see some of your points in this, and that there are times where his offensive production isn't. I could see where that would be what's keeping him out of your mind and being that top tier, because he doesn't produce as much offensively as obviously, some of the other top defensemen like John Carlson or whatnot.
Well, I'm just to clarify a bit on that. I think that, when I'm talking about kind of even strength offense, what I'm thinking isn't necessarily from a production standpoint. I would be more saying as far as his ability to, when I say driving offense, I mean kind of being a guy who, when he's on the ice, the Jackets are getting more offensive opportunities. So not necessarily that those are translating into points directly, but more that he is a guy who, when he's on the ice, the Jackets are getting, better scoring chances and stuff like that.
Well, the one other, I guess, rebuttal I might make is and I understand we're trying, that you're saying this corrects for a lot of, teammate play and all that kind of stuff. The Jackets this year have not been a very good team offensively, just in general. So his number coming down a lot doesn't surprise me. Now, if his number is coming down when other players hasn't, I didn't see this with every other player or not, because I didn't see your visualizations on it. But is that something you were seeing where, like a Ryan Murray or Zach Werenski, their numbers for these are going down as to overtime as well? Or are they staying medium, or what were you seeing with them?
Yeah, so Werenski's even strength offense numbers are actually very solid. Like he ranked in the 93rd percentile among defensemen in even strength offensive goals above replacement. So he's kind of right at the top there. Ryan Murray, again, here I can bring that up. I don't have to talk out of my ass. Yeah, so Ryan Murray is a guy who is consistently kind of in that lower end offensively. So that's not really something where you'd see a kind of trend line going down there. I will say Ryan Murray had a brilliant defensive season. God damn, I'm just looking at his numbers right now, and he was in the 99th percentile among defensemen from a defensive even strength standpoint. So that's something to hang your hat on for sure. I guess that's something where I'd say, I think Ryan Murray deserves quite a bit of credit that he doesn't get. Yeah. Because I think a lot of fans around the league are kind of more attracted to the big names like Seth Jones. again, I think that I guess we kind of talked a little about the transition play and the eye test thing. I think the thing for me, especially kind of when microstats like that come up, is that when the microstats are good and the overall kind of impacts are bad, either offensively in Jones's case or defensively in the case of some other players who we might talk about. What that tells me is that there's something that's not captured by them, and that's not kind of captured by the eye test. So when I say not captured by the eye test, I just mean like the kind of thing that isn't super noticeable. Like this, right. The kind, like we might be seeing, Seth Jones make these really nice transition passes, but maybe there are decisions that he's making when his team has the puck in the offensive zone that aren't getting the job done, but that you might just not notice as much. In the case of defense, you might have a player who's winning a lot of board battles or stripping pucks or doing things like that. But when it comes to their positioning, maybe they're not in the exact right place. Maybe their stick isn't in the right lane. Maybe there's something that they're doing that, even the most kind of seasoned hockey mind isn't going to be able to pick up over an 82 game sample, which is, I think, where kind of the analytics can step in. And I think that when you lean too heavily on the microstats, I think some people are kind of tempted to do that, because in a lot of cases, the microstats reflect the eye test a lot more clearly than the what we call like the underlying numbers do. Because what microstats are doing is they're measuring events, like they're counting events that happen on the ice, and our eyes are drawn to events. We notice when Seth Jones makes good transition plays. We notice when Alex Barkov strips pucks away from players. But we don't notice are things that don't happen, or things that would happen but don't happen because a player isn't in the right place or doesn't quite make the right decision over an 82 game sample. So I would say I think that points to Seth Jones having quite a bit of talent. I think he clearly has shown that he has the ability to be a top defenseman. But I think that there's clearly something going on that, maybe no one's eye test is fine-tuned enough, or, they're focused enough on looking exactly at Seth Jones and ignoring absolutely everything else that's happening on the ice to kind of figure out that might be the thing that's causing that disconnect between, the eye test and the microstats on one side and these kind of aggregate underlying numbers on the other side.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting. It's a shame everything went on pause because for obviously 1,000 reasons, but also I would love to start seeing when we get these tracking stats on players and how much that becomes public, who knows, but just just to see where that comes out on Seth Jones here in the future and what he is. Cause it wouldn't be the first time in history that people overrate a player on reputation if we then find out later, maybe he wasn't as good as we thought, but yeah.
The thing about Jones, at the very least, is that, he's making what, $5.4 million for the next 2 years after this year. Like, it's not like this is a guy who they're paying, $12 million to, who doesn't have like the prettiest underlying numbers. Like, Seth Jones, even if I'm right, even if I say that Seth Jones is just an okay, top four defenseman who's not, as outstanding as his reputation says. Even in that kind of pessimistic assumption, he's still only getting overpaid by, a couple $100,000, which is pretty negligible in the grand scheme of things, especially considering how good some of the Jackets' cheaper players are.
Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely.
At the end of the day, I don't begrudge Jackets fans from loving Seth Jones or being happy with him. And, I have nothing personal against him or any of you guys either.
Oh no, I never take any of that. Anybody who takes this stuff personally are like, oh, you hate my team. That's crazy. People just look at the numbers, they come to their conclusions. That's where it is. It's no big deal. Now jumping into what's probably going to be the more a big question for the Jackets over the next year or two. If you were looking today, because of the numbers you've looked at, between them choosing between Elvis Merzlikins and Jonas Korpisalo, which one of those two goalies would you be leaning towards based on numbers, based on what you've seen on those?
I'm going Elvis all the way. I think that there's very little doubt in my mind that he's the way to go. And that's not to say that again, like I said before, I don't think he's the best goalie in the league. I don't think you necessarily can even count on him to be, let's say an average to above average starter going forward, because, I really, again, this is not something that I necessarily believed until I kind of dove into goalie numbers and goalie performance a little bit more deeply. But I mean, goaltending in the NHL is an absolute crapshoot, like from year to year. And I mean, God, you're a Blue Jackets fan. I don't need to tell you, you've watched Bobrovsky for long enough that you know that like Bobrovsky was the best goalie in the league for like 2 straight years. He had another Vezina on top of that. And then he goes to Florida and completely craps the bed. And then even last year with the Jackets, he wasn't necessarily doing too well until the playoffs there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when it comes down to it, with goaltending, you're always gambling. And the best bet for me is to gamble on a horse that at least has done something good before, and who isn't going to cost you too much. And I think with Korpisalo, I think for a long time, just as an outsider fan and kind of somebody who's kind of been kind of keyed into these conversations and stuff like that, I think Korpisalo for a long time had the kind of built up reputation as kind of the guy who's just waiting to take that next step and become a great starter in the NHL. I think you could talk about him in kind of that same conversation as a UC Saros type, maybe even in like the Matt Murray or Tristan Jarry conversation, as far as these guys who are backups now, but oh God, you just wait, when they're 25, 26, they're going to be, the new guard of elite goaltenders. And I mean, if you just look at his stats, I think it was the other way around. I mean, he stepped in 15, 16, he played 31 games there and he was spectacular. The numbers back that up. 16, 17, he had a bit of a more sideline role. He only played 14 games, but he was still, doing just fine, behind a pretty crummy Jackets defense. But I mean, the past 3 years of kind of being a consistent backup. And then this season, obviously, I think he ended up playing more games than Elvis. The numbers are pretty poor. They rank pretty low. I think as the Jackets have become a better defensive team, and especially they were obviously a great defensive team this year, I think he's kind of in that category of goalies who underperform relative to the quality of shots they face, and he's done so consistently. I mean, if you look back through, just going from 3 years ago to now, in a backup role, like playing less than 82 games, he allowed 8 goals above expected, 10 goals above expected, and then 9 goals above expected this year. So I think that creates a pretty clear pattern of performance from his perspective that would lead me to believe that there really isn't much of a ceiling there, or if it is one, it's not one that's worth taking a gamble on. So even if Elvis is a wild card, because is he going to be the elite goalie that he was for a stretch there last year? Who knows? Is he going to be the crappy goalie that he was, after February? Maybe. Who knows? But I would at least rather take my shot on somebody who, at least in aggregate, profiles pretty well, and who probably would have a cheaper price tag and maybe a little bit of a less of a reputation. And, if I was the Jackets, what I really would be looking at is looking at a guy like Yaroslav Halak, or, maybe trading for a guy who's kind of in a backup role and who can play kind of that 1B role, kind of more of a veteran presence, somebody who has a pretty clear track record of doing well behind strong defenses like the Jackets have, and just kind of roll with it from there, rather than, continuing on kind of an Elvis Eunice roller coaster ride of seeing who's going to be the young guy who grabs the top spot. So yeah, that's my perspective. Again, this is kind of a more of a stats-based perspective. I will admit, I watched Elvis a couple times when he played the Penguins. I was very fond of him when the Penguins destroyed the Jackets in his first NHL game, but I don't quite. But anyway, yeah, no, Elvis would be my preference.
Yeah, Elvis has been he's that up until he was a roller coaster there for a long time, and I mean mostly just down in the early part of the season. Seems like every time he got a chance, he wasn't there, and then it all turned around for him in a game on New Year's Eve when he played the Panthers, and he just looked great. And it was a night when the Jackets' defense, that's normally great, didn't seem to want to do anything, and they left him out to dry a few times, and he looked amazing that night. And since then, he looked really good after that, and he seems to be a goaltender that kind of wants that confidence of being in the number one role as much as he can. So, no, I get your point there. As a Blue Jackets fan, when the Bobrovsky thing was happening, it was the kind of thing where I was saying, I'm fine with keeping Bobrovsky, but not at the dollar. He wanted Carey Price money, and I said, not for that though, because it's a goaltender. Who knows what happens with a goaltender? So
Yeah, no, and for me, no goalie is worth the Carey Price
no
number.
you
I don't
goalies
think I if you had me up against a wall and said that I had to pay a goalie that number just kind of at any point in the past 20 years, maybe for Lundqvist coming out of the 06 lockout is all that I would be able to confidently tell you that I'd pay that contract. But I mean, honestly, like the Jackets, and I think the Penguins are kind of in a similar situation in terms of, I think we both have two young goalies who kind of split the starts and are trying to establish themselves, and who probably aren't going to come in at a super excessive number. And I think the Jackets actually might be in a stronger position than that, because neither of your goalies have a, 2 Stanley Cup rings from 5 years ago that they can, smack on the negotiating table and demand a little bit more money.
Yeah.
But honestly, like the Jackets obviously prefer to have a consistent top goalie, but I mean, that really doesn't exist too much anymore in today's NHL.
Yeah.
And the best you can really hope for is to have a guy who has a decently high ceiling, who you don't have to pay too much. And, like what kind of dollar value would you say that you'd be projecting for a guy like Elvis or even Korpisalo?
Well, so they've re-signed Jonas recently to a 2-year deal, and it was right at
true,
what was it,
right.
2.5 or something like that.
Nice.
It wasn't super high, and the idea is that they will probably get Elvis somewhere right around the same time.
Gotcha.
From what we're seeing,
so disregard Yaroslav Halak. Yaroslav Halak can go somewhere else.
Well, what it seems like the team wants to do is they want to sign them both kind of to similar deals in that range, and then buy themselves another year or two to decide if they want to do a long-term commitment to one or the other. Jonas 2.8 for
that's the best,
next 2 years.
Best scenario.
Yeah. They got
so
Elvis,
again, that's
Elvis is an RFA this season, so they'll probably try and do something similar, 2 years for under 3, and then make a long-term commitment to one or the other, depending on what they see over the next 2 years. Or the Blue Jackets actually have 2 or 3 goaltenders coming up through the pipeline who are also probably NHL, not ready yet, but could be in the next year or two. So they may end up saying, okay, bye to both of them and getting 2 more cheap goaltenders to come up. Who knows? But
see, like honestly, in the year 2020 in the NHL, I feel like that's maybe the best situation you could be in. What I have paid Korpisalo just based on his stats, $2.8 million, and said, I want you on my team for the next 2 years. Maybe not, but honestly, if you can have your goaltending cost under $6 million or around $6 million, and you have kind of those 2 lottery tickets as far as guys who maybe could perform, then I'd say you're in a pretty good spot. So Elvis, for however many years, if he's under $3 million or $3.5 million or what have you, I think the Jackets, in my mind, could be pretty happy with that. And I would like to live in a world where the Penguins could get Matt Murray and Tristan Jarry locked up at that, but I think it's going to be a much more complicated summer for the Pens in that regard.
Yeah, I think Murray's going to walk in the door starting at 4 or 5. I think that's what he's going to ask for. And I think those cups are what's going to inflate his number past what he's actually worth.
Well, we'll see. I wonder how the loyalty factor will play into that. I mean, he was so bad this year. It was kind of a best case scenario as far as when the bad year kind of popped up as far as contract negotiations. Yeah. In terms of making sure they didn't extend him at a big number, but we'll see. I mean, everything's obviously in weird stasis right now.
Yeah.
Who's going to start in the playoffs? Like all those kind of questions are kind of left unanswered. Whereas obviously, if things were going on as normal, we would know the answer right now. But
we'd have some clarity on some things. Goalies really become, I don't know if you follow football at all, but it's become similar to what running back was in the NFL, where people used to sign running backs to huge deals and have, like a franchise running back. And now most teams have bought into this whole, you draft a good running back, you have them for 3 or 4 years, you don't make a big commitment, because they're just, with running backs, it's that they tend to wear down quickly. With goalies, it's just that they're a coin toss. On a given night, you might have somebody who's going to win the game for you, or you might have somebody who's going to let in a 40, something from the blue line. You don't know what you're going to get some nights.
Yeah. So I mean, goaltending is the massive wild card just in hockey in general. And it's kind of every time that I dive a little bit more deeply into goalie analytics and stuff, it really just gives me the sense that, God, like everything is just so variable. I mean,
Yeah.
like you said, night to night, like night to night is one thing, but just season to season. I mean, like you look at, how we talk about kind of goaltenders as being elite, and I've just stopped. Like I am no longer saying that so and so goalie is elite. I don't care how good he is this season. I don't care, if he's Sergei Bobrovsky leading the league for 2 straight years. I don't care if he's Connor Hellebuck, putting together a good Hart Trophy case, because like just with very, very, very few exceptions, just the ability of goalies to just be absolutely spectacular one year and then just completely fall off the face of the earth and cost their teams win after win after win the next year is just insane. And I think that there's a bit of a, you said that there's a bit of an attitude change going on in the NFL around running backs, and I've heard a lot of people say that. I'm not too big a football guy myself, but I think one of kind of the interesting contradictions, or maybe not contradictions, but I guess tensions between the more kind of analytical perspective and the more traditional perspective around goalies, is that I think it's pretty clear from what we've heard from players is that they prefer to have kind of a stable goalie that they can play in front of, like a goalie that they get to know and they get to trust, and they play in front of. Like they want to have it decided who the starting goalie is. And what the numbers tell us is, that's not necessarily the way that you should go. Like you should not necessarily have, your goalie locked up long term and, have him at a big number. And it might be more opportunistic to, try doing like the goalie tandem, or, like what the Islanders have been doing the past couple of years or stuff like that, where if a goalie's hot, you can ride him. If he's not, you can sub somebody else in, or, and on these short-term deals where you can kind of discard them and pick up new goalies and stuff like that. But I feel like players are pretty hostile to that idea, just in terms of the way that they like to play and get comfortable in front of a goalie. So I think that'll be something interesting to watch as kind of analytics become more mainstream, and maybe, God willing, people start to clue in a little bit more about how goalies actually perform from year to year, and start to rethink, I think, some of their assumptions about whether so and so goalie is actually elite or whether it's just all reputation.
All right. So jumping into, and I'm guessing already which player you're going to say on this. If there was a player on the Blue Jackets that you said, hey, this is who I want people to pay attention to, this guy's good, and I'm excited about watching him play, or excited about what he's going to do, who would that be?
Yeah. See, this is where I get all the goodwill back after the Seth Jones side trap. Yeah, I you guessed right. I mean, Oliver Bjorkstrand is just nuts. Like he's a guy who I kind of remember as being a pretty big name as far as like a prospect goes a couple of years ago. I think his perception of him kind of fell a little bit, which is, maybe a little bit unfair, because he's always been a guy who's had pretty good underlying numbers, especially kind of early on. Like when he was kind of 20 and 21, he was playing pretty small roles, but his offensive numbers especially were very impressive. But I think that a thing about him there's two things that impressed me about him. The first one is that his defense has just gotten better and better and better in a way that you don't actually often see with forwards. Like I think people kind of have this perception surrounding forwards, and I think especially kind of high pedigree forwards, that their defense is just going to kind of improve at a linear rate as they get older, because obviously, a lot of it is mythologizing. A lot of it is, oh, you get this kid from the CHL, he doesn't know how to play defense, and then, you get him with a good coach like John Tortorella, and, he's going to teach him how to play D and how to back check and all that stuff, which doesn't actually usually end up happening. What usually happens is if you're a skilled offensive player, you're just going to kind of keep playing offense and neglect defense until later on you're not good enough offensively, and you kind of have to start tidying it up. But in the case of Bjorkstrand, he's just gotten better at defense every year, and to the point now where I would rate him as maybe a top 5 defensive player in the league. Like right now, like his numbers profile in terms of goals above replacement and even strength defense, he was 99th percentile in the NHL. I think that if we were living in a world where second line wingers are in the Selke conversation, he'd be a guy who I'd have as a big candidate for that. And on that note, I think another impressive thing about him is that we talk a lot about these kind of analytical darling players who, we say, oh, like when they get, they're playing on the 4th line, they're playing on the 3rd line, but like, this guy's actually like a superstar. And when he plays on the top line, like he's going to do great and he's going to excel. And I think that there are a couple of cases where that hasn't quite translated, where people have kind of made themselves look a little bit foolish in retrospect by building up players who were, playing smaller roles. But I think when they kind of got that bigger chance, they weren't quite ready for prime time. But the thing about Bjorkstrand is that he's only gotten better as he's gone up the lineup. And I think now he's finally in a position where he's, a really trusted player on that team. And I think he's gotten more opportunities. And obviously with Panarin being gone, I'm sure that opens up a little bit more ice time on the wing. But like, he's a guy who was clearly given an opportunity this year and just ran away with it and became a caliber of player that I don't think that I would have expected him to have in his, in his ability. So he's a guy who's super impressive to me, and I think has gone quite a long way towards solidifying especially the team defense of the Blue Jackets forwards in such a way that I think a lot of people probably weren't expecting going into the season.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about that February swoon where the Blue Jackets started not playing as well. If my memory serves me right, I mean, after Seth Jones went down, it wasn't long after that Bjorkstrand essentially had almost the same injury. He went down with a broken ankle. Yeah. And so losing both those players on defense at once, I mean, like you said, it just dropped him from like 3rd to 8th. But if at the same time your goaltending doesn't hold up as well, losing that can be a big deal, especially with Bjorkstrand being – I mean, Bjorkstrand, from what I'm seeing, I mean, what do you think of his offensive abilities? You said he's, almost Selke level in some ways. But when you're looking at him offensively –
I mean, they're fantastic. I mean, he's, like I said, he was 99th percentile defense. He was a 95th percentile forward this year.
Yeah.
Which is pretty nuts in terms of kind of what you would project for him. I mean, he, like I said in my post, and I stick with it, that I think he might be the most underrated player in the NHL as far as just people kind of not really talking about him at all. You don't hear about him. You definitely don't hear about his defensive play, but I feel like he's not one of those guys who really gets a lot of press or ink spilled about him over the course of the season, when clearly that's something that he deserves.
Yeah. He's, in my estimation, I mean, in previous years, it's always been kind of that, you can kind of see him coming. You can see the potential. You can see this happening. And then this year, in my mind, he's solid. So he is very solid in that conversation of, this is one of the guys you're kind of building around at this point. He's one of those core players on this team.
And I mean, like, one of the fun things about those kinds of players is when it comes to, the time to sign the contracts and everything, they're not exactly making a giant pile of money. Like, he has 1 year left at 2.5, I think, which is one of the, bigger steals in the NHL in terms of the value he's given the Jackets on that deal. But unless he goes and scores 35 goals next year, I can't really envision a situation where he's going to be making more than $6 million or something like that. So I'd say the Jackets are in a pretty good position as far as the kind of discount forward group that they're able to put out right now.
1 year at 2.5, then he's an RFA, so you can try and get a big deal on him there if you want, as far as try and get him locked up long term, which I think they would at this point. All right, and jumping around to some things we're hearing around the league now, kind of getting off the Blue Jackets a little bit. I mean, the big free agent that's going to be this season is going to be Taylor Hall. Is that a player that – because you know that as players get older, sometimes people say, to make sure you don't overpay for them.
Right.
Is that the kind of player that you think a team should go out and be willing to pay top dollar for? Or do you think, maybe he's going to be coming down? What's your views on him?
Are there Jackets fans who are looking at him to fill the Panarin gap possibly?
There's discussion that if you could make a run at him, and right. Where Blue Jackets fans get an idea on this being possible, because we get that we're Columbus, so we normally don't make big free agent signings.
Right.
But at this point, it looks like Columbus is going to have as much cap space, if not more, than most teams, especially in that they're in a situation of being a team that's consistently been in the playoffs. This year, we'll see how things go, because this year's nuts. But if you could get that big kind of player, would that take you over the top? So that's where people are thinking it. But what would be your view on it?
So I think whenever you go after kind of any big player in free agency, I mean, not even necessarily like the huge names, like Taylor Hall would be kind of like a top 5 UFA in the past 10 or 15 years as far as players who are available. Like, we're talking about a guy who, in terms of kind of his reputation and career pedigree, is up there with Tavares and obviously, we'll see if Pietrangelo is coming up this offseason. and that's always a risk. It's always a risk, obviously, to throw around $10 million in free agency, as the Panthers found out this season. Uh, but it can also pay off, which is, I think, not to twist the knife too much, but the Rangers obviously got a Hart Trophy caliber season out of Artemi Panarin, way more than they paid, despite the fact that it was a huge salary. But I think that Taylor Hall might be the biggest risk that I have ever seen as far as if you're paying for a free agent, because a lot of the time with these big guys who are up for a lot of money, it's a very clear, don't do this. Like his underlying numbers are really not that good. You don't want to do it. He's always been overrated, blah, blah, blah. But with Taylor Hall, it is way more complicated because as recently as a season ago, and especially 2 seasons ago, he was legitimately one of the best players in the league, and especially one of the best left wings. Like, even last season, I would probably rank him only behind Mark Stone and maybe Panarin in terms of the top left or wingers in the NHL. Obviously Kucherov is also in that conversation, but this season he really sucked. Like there's no sugarcoating it. He sucked in New Jersey. He sucked in Arizona. Everyone was expecting him to kind of put it together in the desert after he left there, and it just didn't happen. And now you look at his profile. If you kind of timeline his performance throughout his career, it really kind of looks like a decline. And obviously, for me at least, this is why I always kind of emphasize that analytics are about charting performance and not ability. Because, I'm not saying that Taylor Hall is a sub-replacement player. I'm not saying that Taylor Hall is worse than, every forward on the Pittsburgh Penguins. I'm not taking Teddy Bluger over him. But at the same time, I think that we need to accept the fact that Taylor Hall really sucked this year. And if you're going at him with any amount of money, especially the amount of money that he would command in free agency, you're taking on a huge risk that even if he's not as bad as he was this year, if he even splits that difference between how good he was in 18-19 and how good he was this year, you're still hugely overpaying him if you're giving him what I presume he would be worth. But I think it's a crummy situation kind of for everyone, because if you're Taylor Hall, obviously he wants stability. Anybody wants stability. You're trying to get a long-term contract. You're trying to set up your future. But I mean, for Hall, we talk about guys who had excellent contract years. He's not one of them. He had maybe the worst contract year that I can remember in a long time. And any long-term deal that he gets is going to be tainted by that. If he was a free agent in 2019, we'd be talking about $12 million. Now, you can envision a team kind of paying a little too much for him, but I would be very surprised if he kind of got to that height. But then there's also the whole, people are kind of talking about, let's like get a 1-year deal, score 80 points, score 90 points, and then cash out. But I mean, what happens if he's just as bad next year? Because if he's just as bad next year, he'll be looking at a lot less money on the long-term deal than if he settled this year. So, I guess my general answer to your question would be, I would be very wary of signing Taylor Hall to anything above $8 million on a long-term deal. And even then, I think that there's a huge amount of risk involved there that would make me just more likely than not just kind of turn around and focus on trading or developing my own players.
It almost feels like it's a situation where, like you're saying, someone's going to get him for 6 or 7 years at 8 or 9 million, and then if he ends up going back to what he could be, or at least what he's been in the past at different times, then everybody goes, oh, what a value contract. That was an amazing signing. And then if he ends up being what he was this year, it'll be this albatross of an $8 million contract for 6, 7 years that is just hanging around there. It feels like that's kind of what, we're going to look at it being one thing or the other at that point.
No, because I mean, I can't remember a time when a player of his pedigree who was up for unrestricted free agency went from being an elite player to being sub-replacement over the course of one season, and then was up for unrestricted free agency right afterwards. Like, it's just, it's not often that a guy with I almost called him Taylor Swift, with Taylor Hall's pedigree is up as a free agent, let alone that he goes up as a free agent with this amount of uncertainty surrounding him. So, God knows. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. I can't imagine that this is going to be the best situation for Taylor Hall. Look, if you wanted to sign a 1-year contract and play with Sidney Crosby, I wouldn't say no. But I feel like more likely than not, some team like Colorado will swing in and give him like a $9 million deal or over however many years, and maybe they'll look smart, maybe they'll look dumb, but I feel like it just shows how much uncertainty there is in how players perform and how dangerous it is to just kind of make assumptions based on a player's reputation that they're going to play to a certain caliber.
Right. One other rumor I want to ask you about, because this one's been circulating, and I don't know how much truth there is to it, but there's been the rumor circulating that the Panthers might trade Alexander Barkov, and
So they might trade Alexander Barkov.
Huh?
The Panthers might trade Barkov.
It's been a rumor. I don't know how much truth there is to it.
Oh, right, because they're like blowing up the team, right?
Right. That's what we've heard, or that's what some people are saying. So I want a two-part question. One, does that make any sense at all? And two, if you were another team and the Panthers were actually going to do it, I mean, would there be a price you wouldn't pay to get Barkov? I mean, other than obviously like Connor McDavid or something, but I mean, just that whole thing.
Yeah, there's a lot to. Barkov's a really interesting player. There's a lot going on with Barkov because, God, I don't even know which direction to take this. I guess the first thing I would say is that if you're the Panthers, trading Barkov would be really stupid, not even just kind of because of the quality of player he is, but also because he had a real bad season by his standards this year. Like if you kind of look at the curve of his kind of career arc, he was superb in 18-19, and he really just was not that great this year. He had an off season by his standards, especially on the defensive side of the puck. But I think his offense also took a pretty big dip as far as his even strength performance. So if you're the Panthers right now, would be the absolute stupidest time to trade Barkov. At the same time, with kind of roles reversed, if I'm a team like, let's say Montreal, like one of those teams that's been consistently struggling to get a number one center, Barkov is a guy that I would definitely target. But I will say, and I guess this is where, my take gets a little bit more controversial, is I think that they have to be realistic about his skill set and abilities, because kind of on the same note as Seth Jones, and I think I kind of hinted at it before, I think Barkov's defensive play has been overrated by a long shot for the past 3 years. And I think people have kind of built him up to be this genius, brilliant, two-way, Selke beast that he really was for 1 year there in 16-17 and hasn't been since. So like last year, he was one of the best centers in the NHL. Like he was in the 99th percentile in forwards in wins above replacement. Like he was nuts, but he was nuts offensively and on the power play. I think his defensive play has actually been average to below average, especially this season, but for the past 3 years. So if you're a team who's trading for Barkov, I think that it's easy for people to get enamored by his nice takeaway numbers. He obviously has a lot of highlights where he, strips the puck off guys and makes them look stupid. But what you'd be acquiring in Barkov is a elite offensive player, and elite offensive centers are worth a hell of a lot. But as long as they were kind of willing to understand that this is not a guy that they are acquiring so that he can be, late career Steve Yzerman, or, a guy who's going to make their penalty kill, a lot better. Like he's not prime Jonathan Toews in that respect. He's just a ridiculously creative and skilled and productive offensive player. And that's what you're getting from him. So, I mean, if the Panthers are stupid enough to trade him when his value is probably at its lowest, then they can go right ahead. I don't think that that's a very smart move on their part. But at the same time, I think that I have more complicated views on Alex Barkov than a couple of people might.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. I want to thank you for your time today. It's been awesome. Do want to ask, other than seeing you on Twitter at JFreshHockey, how do people get more of your insights, more of what you're talking about?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now, Twitter is kind of my main area. I mean, especially in this quarantine, it's where I'm spending way too much of my time. So you can definitely see plenty of posts from me on there. I'm moving right now. I'm in the process of putting a site together where all of my visualizations would be available to Patreon subscribers. So you'd be able to check everything out there. In the meantime, you can subscribe to me on Patreon. You do get access to a certain number of visualizations that I just have as kind of being available, not on the site right now, including a lineup creator, like a roster creator that uses wins above replacement and allows you to basically create a lineup either from this season or from any season since 2007-08. And it kind of shows you what the wins above replacement of each player based on the role that you've given them in the lineup. And then kind of projects how many points in the standings that team would get. So, just kind of a fun time waster, as well as a way for you to you pick a goalie and then you can see where they've ranked in the NHL among starters in goals saved above expected over the course of their careers in each season in the regular season and playoffs, which I think is just kind of a fun way to visualize just how much of a crapshoot goaltending is and how certain goaltenders might be overrated at certain points of their careers. Not to call out Marc-Andre Fleury too much here, but so those are available right now if you subscribe. Otherwise, check me out on Twitter at JFreshHockey. I'm still in the midst of posting the hashtag 31 days 31 teams rundown, where every day I take a look at a different team in the NHL. Just posted Philadelphia today. Got some pretty unhappy replies for my assessment of Kevin Hayes, but nonetheless,
they love Kevin Hayes.
Just check. Oh yeah, so check me out on there, and you'll be able to see anything that I have in the future. I'll post it on there first.
Oh, well, thank you very much for your time today, Jay Fresh, and have a good one. Stay safe out there.
Yeah, you too.